Family member of a friend who worked at a morgue said that frequently, because bodies still have air trapped in them at the time of death, they would make a brief moaning noise. So it sounds like they're alive and groaning, but it's just the gas escaping. Funeral director here. A man who died of a heart attack in his home while showering. Very isolated house, water keeps running for days. He was completely melted by the time we got him. Human goo. Less gory, but on a regular basis, when they open their eyes when moved, and stare right into your soul with their dead eyes. Always creeps me out no matter how many hundreds I've handled. I just remembered one, but it wasn't me, it was a colleague of mine. Full summer heat, body was left for days in his apartment, smelled all the way to the street from the 4th floor. When they moved him, the skin from his face slipped and fell and my colleague slipped on it, like on a banana peel. He had to take the rest of the day off. My former boss told me about one guy who jumped off his building, like straight up, and on impact his legs just got crushed upward and his tibias pierced through his skull. Did a pathology rotation in med school, which included a week in the morgue to help with autopsies. Ended up cutting on and holding the brain of one of my high school classmates. Didn't realize it until halfway through when I noticed the tag on the table. That hit me like a truck. Also weird was then going home and seeing the tributes and RIP messages about him on Facebook. I used to intern for the FBI when I was in college, and I only saw bodies at the morgue. However, there was this one time one of the agents brought us along to a serious case they had. When we entered the morgue he told us to stand back. The body had just entered and you could smell it instantly. I know it's not creepy, but that was the first time I smelled a decomposing body. It was of someone who was left to drown in a lake. My mom buried her dog, then changed her mind about him being buried, dug him up, then left him in the vet's fridge for a week, until I was able to get to her house so we could bury him in a marble planter. Bizarre, I know. We had to drive him from the vet's to her house, probably a 15 minutes drive max. The smell was horrific. He had obviously gotten wet when he was buried, and decomposed for the 3 to 4 days during the summer that he was in the ground, then the day that he was in her garage. I couldn't get rid of the smell in my nose for a few days, and her car always smelt of it after that. Ex-cop, guy had hung himself from a tree in the woods, and had jumped from a high branch. Except the fall hadn't killed him and snapped his neck. When he jumped, he fell onto another snapped, sharp, branch which had gone through his neck and bottom jaw and had come out of his nose cavity. It looked like he had a very painful suicide. Poor guy. Not my experience, but a guy I've worked with for years as retired detective. They found a body that was beaten really bad, couldn't even see the guy's face, he was barely alive. They brought him, the body, back to the hospital and they tried to save him but he didn't make it. When the nurse took the wallet out of the pocket to check the ID, she realized it was her son the entire time. He was beaten so bad she didn't recognize him. Guy said he had to retire after that. It was the worst thing he's had to witness. Can't even imagine being that mother. So I'm a nurse and work with recently expired patients frequently. I work in a medical ICU. We have the highest rate of patient mortality because patients are very sick, usually with multiple chronic comorbidities and multi-organ failure. But honestly, nothing tops the first time I handled a deceased person 2 weeks into my first job as a CNA at a nursing home. I got my report for the start of the shift and was told to check on one resident first, as he was actively dying and liable to pass away any minute. So I walk into their room and just stood there for a good 2 minutes, waiting to see a breath. When none came, I touched his skin. Still sort of warm, but definitely cooler and waxier skin than is normal. I got my supervisor who confirmed that he was in fact dead. She said she could handle cleaning him up if I wanted, since I was new, but I wanted to learn and gain that experience. So I start talking to him as I roll him over to clean him up, change his brief, etc. It helps to pretend they're still alive, and it's respectful. He lets out this low groan, like a zombie getting up for the first time in the movies. Scared the crap out of me. I jumped back and my supervisor giggled just a tiny bit before regaining her composure and explaining that gas escapes especially during movement and that's why he made that noise. 10 years later, I've worked at all kinds of nursing homes and hospice and, now the hospital, caring for many patients who have died. Almost 100 by now, according to my best estimate. No one has ever made that noise since. Maybe a little rush of air, like someone breathing out, but not that spooky groan. I don't mind working with bodies, honestly it's a very unique and humbling experience and I usually feel like I am at my best when working with people who are circling the drain, but I do find it silly or odd that no one has grown since. Also, I've seen a lot of families react to their loved one passing. Some handle it better than others, but I think the best I've seen are Hmong families. They have such a ritual, cleaning the body and dressing it in the special outfit and shoes and stuff. Everyone knows what to do. They have a sort of guide which helps a lot, as opposed to many other people who are just at a loss for what to do with themselves. Everyone grieves in their own way, and I am honored to help people process their emotions, but I wish more families had those kinds of rituals to help them through such a big life event. It really seems to be comforting. Also, most people don't know this, but if your loved one passes away in the hospital, you should know that we take extra care not to have their head bonk the metal gurney when we move them from the bed, and then to the storage slab in the morgue. It makes an awful sound and just seems wrong. I don't know why I wanted to mention that, but it's one of those things that we don't talk about. Like an unspoken rule. Don't let the head bonk. My uncle is a retired constable. He said back in the 70s when he was doing his police training, he had to watch the autopsy being conducted as part of the training. I guess to see if he could actually stomach it. The body they were using had been dead quite a few weeks. The smell was horrendous. It had also had a substantial gas buildup, so much so that the man's ballsack had actually inflated like a balloon. To deflate it and let all the gas escape, he said the pathologists used a scalpel to burst it. He said it sounded like a balloon deflating when it was going down. In his words, it was quite traumatic to witness, but he can never keep a straight face whenever he's telling the story years later. Police officer here. Got a call in a trailer park retirement community for a bad smell coming from one of the trailers. I immediately knew it was the smell of a dead body. Guy's daughter came with a key and gave me permission to enter. When I first walked in the door, it was to a long hallway. At the end of the hallway was a TV which was all snow and very loud. Reminded me of Poltergeist. It was the only light in the place. The windows were all covered in foil. As I walked down the hall, I could see and hear multiple flies in the light of the TV. I found him naked and dead on the kitchen floor. Natural causes. He had become a shut-in. His daughter was trying to be a part of his life, but he often wouldn't take her calls. He had no other friends or family. He had been there for at least a month. When the medical examiner transport service arrived to remove the body, he ruptured. Think of a water balloon bursting. His skin hung like drapes as they lifted him. I had to go home after to shower and get a new uniform, because the death smell on me was so bad. I thought I was fine, but a month later I saw something in a grocery store that reminded me of it. I had to leave my card and walk out. Embalmer/funeral director. It's not too bad once you get used to it, to be honest. The hardest thing to get over was in mortuary school. Our class would go down to the Chicago medical examiner's office once a week for 6 months to practice embalming. The bodies we were working on were in bad shape, and had usually been sitting in the cooler for months. Freshest we had was 4 weeks dead, oldest was 1.5 years. Most of the time they were nasty. We were there for 5 hours straight with no breaks from 3 to 8 p.m., after having already been at school for the day. The hardest part was being ravenously hungry while working on, like, a 4-month-old decomp case that's literally swimming in their own decomp fluids in the body bag. It's a weird feeling. So, Chicago is known for its gun violence, and the Cook County Medical Examiner processes a lot of gun deaths. The bodies that my class were allowed to work with, though, were indigent cases, usually the homeless, impoverished, or people from nursing homes, so we didn't usually see any homicide victims or otherwise violent deaths. One week, though, one of the groups in my class was adamant that their person had a gunshot wound in their shoulder. One of the guys was running around to the other groups all excited, telling us about this gunshot and how we just had to see it. We all went and crowded around their table, trying to get a peek at this wound. The lighting wasn't great and it was on the back of the shoulder, but it did look like there was a hole there, so we were pretty excited. One of the instructors walked over to see what we were all gawking at. He took one look at the guy's shoulder, reached out and scratched off the wound. It was a dirty penny that was just stuck onto the guy's skin, then called us all idiots and told us to get back to our own tables. 1 week, there was a body that was over 700 pounds, with both legs amputated just above the knee. On top of that, they were also a decomp case, with lots of skin slip, just like it sounds, skin really fragile and sloughing off, and what felt like gallons of fluids just everywhere. So, they're massive, and slippery, and no convenient handholds without the legs. They needed to be moved from the body bag they were in, swimming in their own fluids, onto 2 tables that had been pushed together. They weren't going to fit onto one. You're technically supposed to have body lifting devices to help you out, But people in funeral service rarely follow OSHA standards, and they sure as hell weren't going to spend the money for us students. So about 10 of us just banded together to try and get them moved over. It was super nerve-wracking, since we knew that if we dropped them that we would not be able to pick them back up. It took a good 20 minutes, but we managed to shift them over onto the fresh tables. We were all generously soaked in fluids, and still had 4.5 hours left to go before we could leave. That was not a fun day. Cleaning the floor afterwards also was not fun. The worst is knowing how long it takes to die sometimes. We had someone admitted to the hospital for respite care. The family had her home with hospice, but it became too much for them to care for her. She was obviously near death. We thought maybe a day or two at most. She had cancer, skin was dying and falling off of her. Her circulation shut down. Her legs and feet were dying. She lasted 7 more days. It was agonizing to watch. The pain, the smell, was awful. When I was an EMT in a big city, we had to deliver a dead body to a medical school. They were going to use the body for research. When we brought the body in, they immediately took a leather harness and wrapped it around the head and raised it up to where it was hanging. They then slid it into a freezer with other dead bodies hanging by their heads. My father later donated his body to the same place, and now all I can think about is how my dad was hanging in a freezer until they needed him. I go on wellness checks from time to time, basically someone calling 911 because they are worried something has happened to a relative or neighbor and can't get in touch with them. I work in an urban area, let's just call it not such a nice neighborhood. Unemployment, drugs, crime, etc. Mostly 2-story row homes. When we respond we always knock, but no one ever answers, so we put a ladder up to the 2nd-story window. They are rarely locked, and if they are it's less destructive prying them than the front door. So, I have just flopped myself through a bedroom window into someone's home. I am always very sure to announce who I am and why I'm there. Usually the smell gives it away instantly. Someone has passed away at home and it took a couple days for anyone to notice. Sometimes it's nothing and nobody is home. But sometimes, even without any clues, I just get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach that I am somewhere I shouldn't be, and am about to see something I don't really want to. It's like the house is telling me that something terrible has happened inside. Can't explain it, but that feeling is never wrong. Then you find yourself hunting for the body you are sure is there, in someone's home that you have never been in before. It's a creepy feeling. Coming across pets scares the crap out of you. Sometimes the stove is still on, which is always unsettling for some reason. If I have to go in the basement, I always have a little gut check moment at the top of the steps. The weird feeling ones always end up being the odds and the suicides. A homicide discovered this way as well. It never gets less creepy, especially if you come across the body before letting the other guys in the front door. I work for the fire department, by the way. Not just a random guy off the street breaking into houses. Cops are always with us, but they usually aren't volunteering to be first up the ladder. Not me, but my dad's story. He worked as a journalist for finance and business in Asia. We lived in Thailand in 2004 when the tsunami hit. Luckily, we lived away from the beaches so we were fine. He drove to a popular tourist area, Khao Lak, 2 days after to examine the damage with my mom, while sending me to a hospital to help as a translator between tourists and the Thai staff. What he saw has been etched in his mind ever since. As he described it, it was a beautiful day on the beach, blue skies, the sun was out, gentle waves, coconut trees swaying in the wind. Birds singing. On the shore, there were hundreds of bloated corpses. Some were missing limbs, some were in body bags, all were severely disfigured. The mix of the sun and the water just destroyed the bodies completely, and they were moved by locals on trucks to the nearest temple, as they had run out of space for corpses at the morgue. The corpses didn't even look human. It's insane how fast a body gets affected in those conditions. The worst thing for him wasn't what he saw though, it was the smell. That stuck with him, and he couldn't stand eating steaks or red meat for the next 3 months.